The Man in the Iron Mask. In 1703, a prisoner died in the Bastille after spending decades locked away in French prisons. His identity remains one of history's greatest mysteries, but the circumstances of his confinement were undeniably real. The man who would become known as the Iron Mask was arrested in 1669 and immediately placed under extraordinary security measures. Unlike typical prisoners, this man was never allowed to show his face. Guards fitted him with a mask made of black velvet, reinforced with steel bands and locked at the back of his head. The mask had a small opening for his mouth, allowing him to eat and speak, but preventing anyone from seeing his features. He wore this device every moment of every day for over 3 decades. The constant pressure of the mask against his face caused severe skin irritation. The metal bands dug into his scalp, creating permanent grooves in the bone. The velvet interior, which could never be properly cleaned, became a breeding ground for infection. Sores developed around his mouth and nose, festering in the dark, damp interior of the mask. For 34 years, this man existed in a state of enforced anonymity. He could not feel fresh air on his face. He could not scratch an itch on his cheek. Guards who brought him food reported that he sometimes wept inside the mask, the tears pooling against the velvet and soaking his skin. The psychological torment was equally severe. He knew that his face had become his prison within a prison. By the time of his death in 1703, the prisoner had worn the mask for so long that his facial muscles had atrophied from disuse. When attendants finally removed it after his death, they found his skin had grown pale and thin from decades without sunlight. The indentations from the metal bands had become permanent. Prison officials burned all of his possessions immediately after his death. Whatever secrets the prisoner possessed died with him, sealed behind decades of enforced silence. Buried alive in Little Ease. Beneath the Tower of London's White Tower lay a series of underground chambers known as the Little Ease. The name was a grim joke. The cell measured 4 feet by 4 feet, too small for an adult to fully stand, sit, or lie down. Prisoners were forced into a permanent crouch, their bodies contorted in positions that became agonizing within hours. In 1581, Edmund Campion, a Jesuit priest, was held in Little Ease for 4 days. His legs cramped almost immediately. The forced, squatting position cut off circulation to his lower body. He tried shifting his weight, but there was nowhere to move. His back pressed against one wall, his knees against another. The ceiling was too low to stand, the floor too narrow to stretch out. The cell had no toilet facilities. Campion sat in his own filth as hours turned to days. The smell became unbearable in the enclosed chamber. Rats, attracted by the waste, entered through gaps in the stone. They crawled over his body in the darkness, biting at any exposed skin. By the second day, his joints had swollen from the unnatural position. His knees locked in place, the cartilage grinding against bone. The lack of sleep compounded his suffering. Every time exhaustion overtook him and his eyes closed, his body would sag, causing fresh pain that jolted him awake. In the absolute darkness, Campion began to see shapes that weren't there, hear voices in the silence. His mind was fracturing under the sensory deprivation. On the 4th day, guards finally opened the cell. Campion could not walk. His legs had been in the cramped position for so long that the muscles had seized completely. The guards had to carry him out. When physicians examined him, they found his leg bones had begun to deform from the constant pressure. The cartilage in his knees was permanently damaged. When he was finally executed by hanging, drawing, and quartering on December 1st, 1581, witnesses noted that he could barely stand on the scaffold. His legs, ruined by 4 days in a cell too small for a human body, could no longer support his weight. The Oubliette's forgotten prisoner. The Château de Pierrefonds in northern France contained a feature that embodied medieval cruelty in its purest form. An oubliette, from the French word oublier, meaning to forget. It was a vertical shaft cut into the bedrock beneath the castle, accessible only through a trapdoor in the floor above. Once a prisoner was dropped through that opening, they were literally forgotten by the world above. In 1406, a minor nobleman named Jacques de Belleville was accused of plotting against the Duke of Orléans. Guards threw him through the opening into a shaft 30 feet deep. He landed hard on the stone floor, shattering his left leg and several ribs. As he lay gasping in pain, the trapdoor slammed shut above. He was now in complete darkness, sealed in a cylindrical pit barely 6 feet in diameter. For the first few days, Jacques screamed until his voice gave out. The stone walls absorbed his cries completely. No response ever came. Food arrived irregularly through the trapdoor, sometimes a crust of moldy bread, other times a bowl of thin gruel lowered on a rope. There was no pattern, no way to mark time. In the perpetual darkness, time became meaningless. His broken leg never healed properly. Without medical attention, the bones knitted together at wrong angles. Infection set in, fever consumed him for weeks, but he survived. The leg remained useless, bent unnaturally. He could only crawl now, dragging himself across the damp stone floor. Water seeped constantly through cracks in the stone. The floor was always wet. His clothes rotted away within months, leaving him naked in the cold dampness. The darkness destroyed his mind. Without light, Jacques couldn't tell if his eyes were open or closed. He saw shapes that moved and shifted, hallucinations born from sensory deprivation. He spoke to people who weren't there, carrying on conversations with the walls. Years passed. His body adapted to the confined space in disturbing ways. His muscles atrophied, his spine curved from years of being unable to stand straight. In 1419, 13 years after his imprisonment began, renovation work on the castle led workers to discover the sealed Oubliette. When they finally opened the trapdoor and lowered a torch, they found a creature that barely resembled a human. Jacques de Belleville, now completely mad, crawled away from the light, making inhuman sounds. He died 3 days after being brought to the surface, his body unable to handle the change. The Scavenger's daughter's compression. In 1534, Leonard Skevington, lieutenant of the Tower of London, invented a device that compressed the human form until bones shattered and organs failed. Prisoners called it the Scavenger's daughter. Unlike the rack that pulled the body apart, this device did the opposite. It forced the body to fold in on itself until it broke. The device consisted of iron hoops and bars arranged in a rigid frame. When a prisoner was placed inside, they were forced to kneel with their head pushed down toward their chest. Their arms were pulled forward and locked against their shins. The entire body folded in on itself, compressed into the smallest possible space. Then the frame was tightened with screw mechanisms. In 1546, Thomas Fitzgerald, an Irish nobleman accused of treason, was subjected to the Scavenger's daughter. Guards positioned the iron frame around his body and began turning the screws. With each rotation, the iron bands drew closer together. His knees pressed harder against his chest, forcing air from his lungs. His spine curved unnaturally as the frame forced his head downward. Within minutes, breathing became a struggle. After 15 minutes, his ribs began to crack. The sound was distinct, like green wood breaking. His internal organs were being crushed between his ribcage and his knees. He vomited, but with his head locked facing downward, it ran down his face and into his nose, blocking his airways. Blood vessels in his face burst from the pressure, turning his skin purple. After an hour, blood began leaking from his nose and ears. The pressure inside his skull had become so great that blood vessels were rupturing. His breathing came in shallow, desperate gasps. When the interrogators finally released him, his body didn't unfold naturally. Guards had to physically pull his limbs apart, each movement causing fresh screams. The damage was permanent. Multiple ribs were fractured. His spine had been compressed so severely that he had lost nearly 3 inches of height. Most devastating was the damage to his lungs, which never fully recovered from being crushed. Thomas Fitzgerald survived the Scavenger's daughter, but spent the rest of his short life struggling to breathe. The Pit of Despair. Beneath Buda Castle in Hungary lay a cylindrical shaft carved into the bedrock, 40 feet deep and 10 feet in diameter. There was no stairway, no ladder, only smooth stone walls impossible to climb. Prisoners were lowered into it and left to rot. In 1541, Hungarian nobleman István Verbocsi was accused of conspiring with Austrian forces. His punishment was the pit. Guards bound his hands and lowered him on a rope through the opening at the top. He descended through darkness until his feet touched the stone floor below. The rope was pulled up immediately, leaving him in complete blackness. The pit's diameter was just wide enough that he couldn't touch opposite walls simultaneously. The ceiling was 40 feet above. Completely unreachable, there was no way out. The floor was covered in a thick layer of human waste, the accumulated filth of previous prisoners. The smell was overwhelming. Food came once a day, maybe. A bucket would be lowered containing moldy bread and water. Sometimes rats would reach it first. The rats were everywhere, thriving in the darkness. At night, they climbed on Verbocsi while he tried to sleep, biting any exposed skin. Within weeks, his sense of time completely disintegrated. The pit was always dark. There was no day or night. He tried counting food deliveries, but sometimes they didn't come at all. He would wake from fitful sleep with no idea if he'd been unconscious for hours or minutes. He began talking to himself just to hear a human sound, conducting full conversations with imaginary people. His body deteriorated rapidly. Standing in filth constantly, his feet and legs developed severe infections. The skin rotted away in places, exposing raw flesh beneath. He couldn't keep the wounds clean. His clothes disintegrated. He was naked in the darkness, covered in filth, a mass of infected wounds and rat bites. The psychological breakdown came gradually. He started to see figures in the darkness that moved and spoke. The hallucinations became more vivid until he could no longer distinguish them from reality. In 1544, 3 years after being lowered into the pit, Verbocsi was found dead when guards lowered food and received no response. His body was emaciated to the point of starvation, covered in hundreds of rat bites. His eyes had clouded over from years in absolute darkness. His face was frozen in an expression of absolute horror. Immurement in the Abbey wall. In 1317, Sister Angelica of the Order of St. Clare faced punishment for unauthorized religious writing. Her sentence was immurement, being sealed alive within a wall. The practice was reserved for nuns and monks who violated their vows. The condemned would be placed in a small cell built into a monastery wall, then the entrance would be bricked up, leaving only a small opening for minimal food and water. Sister Angelica's cell measured 3 feet wide, 6 feet long, and 7 feet high. She could stand, but not lie down fully. 3 walls were solid stone. The 4th wall had a small opening at waist height, barely 6 inches square. This was her only connection to the outside world. Through it would pass her meager daily rations. On the morning of her immurement, Angelica was led to the cell while other nuns chanted prayers. She stepped inside and turned to face the opening. Then, as she watched, 2 masons began laying bricks. Layer by layer, they sealed her in. When the wall was complete, the ceremony was finished. Angelica stood in her cell, trying to process what had just happened. This was where she would die, and that could take years. Food came once a day, a bowl of thin gruel and a small cup of water, barely enough to sustain life. A bucket in the corner served as a toilet. Once a day, she would push it to the opening and a lay sister would empty it. There was no privacy, no dignity. The cell always carried the smell of human waste. The isolation was worse than the physical deprivation. Days would pass where the only human interaction was the hand pushing the bowl through the opening. She tried to speak to whoever delivered the food, but they were under orders not to respond. She was a ghost, already dead to the convent community. Sleep became impossible. The cell was too short to lie down, so she had to sleep sitting against the wall. Weeks turned to months. Her body broke down from starvation. She grew skeletal. Her hair fell out. Her teeth loosened and fell out. Hallucinations started in the 2nd year. She began seeing angels, hearing voices. In 1321, 4 years after her immurement began, the daily food delivery received no response. Sister Angelica had finally died. She was 28 when immured, 32 when she died, having spent those 4 years slowly starving to death in a stone box 3 feet wide. The Cage of Münster. In 1536, the German city of Münster witnessed one of history's most prolonged prison deaths. After Anabaptist radicals were defeated, their leaders, Jan van Leyden, Bernhard Knipperdolling, and Bernhard Krechting, faced an execution designed to display their deaths as a warning for generations. After being tortured with red-hot pincers, the 3 men were killed on January 22nd in Münster's marketplace. But death was not the end. Their bodies were placed inside specially constructed iron cages and hoisted to the top of St. Lambert's church tower, where they would remain on permanent display. The cages were designed with cruel precision. Each measured roughly 5 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet, sized for a human body but too small for comfort, even in death. The iron bars were spaced close enough to prevent the body from falling through, but wide enough that every detail of decomposition would be visible from the ground. In the first weeks, the bodies were still recognizable. As February arrived and temperatures rose, decomposition accelerated. The smell reached the streets below. By spring, the bodies had begun to melt. The flesh, softened by decay, began to slough off the bones. Pieces fell through the cage bars, raining down on the plaza below. Birds landed on the cages to feast on the decomposing flesh. Summer brought flies in swarms. The cages became writhing masses of maggots, consuming the soft tissues and leaving bones behind. By the first winter, the bodies were mostly skeletal, but bones don't decompose quickly. The skeletons remained intact, held in standing positions by the cage design. Even as skeletons, they were clearly human figures. Years passed. Rain washed through the cages, slowly turning the bones gray. The skeletons gradually disarticulated, bones separating and falling through the bars. By the 5th year, each cage contained only a jumbled pile of bones at the bottom. But still, the cages remained. Decades passed. New generations grew up seeing the iron cages as a permanent feature of the church tower. The truly horrifying aspect was the endless nature of this prison. Even death brought no escape. The 3 men's remains were trapped in those cages for over 400 years. The cages themselves are still there today, empty now, but still hanging from the tower. For centuries, those men's remains hung in their iron prisons, denied even the dignity of burial, a death that refused to end.